Hi, welcome back. Guess what? I have some great news. You're about 25% done with this course. You've made it this far. And today we're going to move on to a more interesting section, and that section is called Your First Radio. And to help out with this section, I brought along my first radio in order to show you. And I'll use it to explain some of the concepts that you'll need to know for the exam. So this is called a handheld radio, and you can probably guess why it's called that because you can hold it in your hand. So your first radio will probably be a handheld as well. Most people get their handhelds as their first radios. So you'll notice it looks a lot like a walkie-talkie with a really big antenna, but it's much more awesome and useful than a walkie-talkie. So let me turn it on for you.
Frequency mode.
So voila, the handheld. So this here on the screen is the frequency. I'm not sure if you can see let me turn the light back on. 146.530 megahertz is the frequency. And I can change the frequency with these up and down buttons or with this dial up at the top of the radio. So now the big button on the side here, this is the transmit button. So if I press this transmit button, a red light will come up here and it will transmit whatever I say. This is KD2EOM, KD2EOM testing. And we just made a transmission. So this button, by the way, it's also called the push to talk button because you push it in order to talk. So this is actually abbreviated PTT for short, push to talk PTT. And sometimes with handhelds, you can actually also attach an external microphone to your handheld. So give me a quick second here. Okay.
The glass.
Okay, so now I have an external microphone and I can talk into the microphone instead, and now the push to talk button is all the way over here. KD2EOM, KD2EOM testing. So there we go. Alright, so a long time ago, it might interest you to know this, but radios didn't actually have push to talk buttons originally, and they didn't have this button on the side for you to transmit. So what the operator would have to do sometimes is he would actually have to leave the room and flip several switches in order to go from transmit to receive. And there's more about this in the Gordon West manual. There's actually a funny story about this. But anyway, these handheld radios, they actually have plenty of cool features. And one of the cool features they have is they have what we call memory channels. And the memory channels are they're memory banks in the radio where you can store certain frequencies. So this radio calls it channel mode. So see, if you'll notice here, I have programmed in all sorts of frequencies in here with sort of names on them. And this one that says VHF and this one that says UHF, these are actually, I programmed in the national calling frequencies for 2 meters and 70 centimeters. Remember, we talked about national calling frequencies, I believe, in the last lesson or 2 lessons ago. So now whenever I want to go to these frequencies, it's very easy. All I have to do is press a button or type a number on the keypad. So this up here at the top of the antenna, this is of the radio, this is obviously the antenna. Now handhelds usually have what we call rubber duck antennas. And you might be wondering why they're called rubber duck antennas. It doesn't look much like a rubber duck, it's not even yellow. Well, like the word ham radio, the origin of the name is rather strange. And there are several rumors again as to why rubber duck antennas are called rubber duck antennas. One theory is that President Kennedy's very young daughter in the White House, she saw this sort of antenna in the White House on a Secret Service agent's radio, and she was so little she pointed to it and she randomly said rubber ducky. And because of that, they started calling it a rubber ducky antenna. I don't know. Anyway, it's called a rubber ducky antenna or a rubber duck antenna, and you should know that for the test. And another thing you should know, rubber duck antennas like this, they're not as effective as regular antennas. You see, in order to make such a small antenna, in order to make the antenna fit on this tiny handheld radio, they actually had to make it smaller than it usually is. Believe it or not, usually it would be a lot bigger than this, even though this might look pretty big to you. So they had to shrink the antenna down, and when they did that, they had to decrease performance. So rubber ducky antennas aren't as good as regular full-size antennas. And another thing is that these rubber duck antennas, they don't work well in cars because the metal in your car, outside your car, it actually absorbs most of the radio signals. So if you want to transmit in your car, you don't want to be holding this in your hand as you're driving along. It's best to put an antenna. A lot of people put antennas outside their car on the roof or on the trunk. And so believe it or not, we've actually covered 3 or 4 test topics just through this casual conversation and looking at my ham radio. But now I'm going to put this away and we're going to move a little more to the technical side of things because there are a few things that you do need to memorize for the test that I can't really show you with this handheld radio. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk a little about ham radio modes. And we started talking about this a few lessons ago. But specifically today we're going to look at the FM mode in ham radio. And the reason for this is that FM is the mode used by most handheld radios. And since this section is on handheld radios, it's called Your First Radio, and Your First Radio will probably be a handheld. FM is the mode that we're going to be focusing on today. So FM might sound familiar to you, and that's because it's the same mode that's used by normal radio stations nowadays, like the kinds that transmit music that can be received maybe in your car or on your stereo system at home, that kind of FM radio. It's the same kind of FM radio used in ham radio. So you'll remember that we said, I explained to you a few lessons ago that ham radio has different modes because there are different ways or different modes of talking to other hams on the air. So I explained to you how there's the voice mode, we talk to hams with our voice, and then there's also the Morse code mode, we can talk to hams using Morse code, etc., etc. But it turns out that things get even more complicated when it comes to modes. See, there actually isn't just a single voice mode or a single mode of using your voice to talk to people. There are actually many different types of modes for communicating audio over ham radio that people can use when they're talking to other hams. So this might be a little confusing to you at first. Why are there so many? Why can't we just have one mode for transmitting audio? Why do we need to make things more complicated and have all these different modes we can use for transmitting the same thing, which is audio or the sound of your voice? Well, each voice mode, and by the way, modes that transmit audio are called voice modes because you use them to transmit your voice. Each voice mode works actually in a slightly different way. They use a different method to convey the audio to the other person. And because they all work differently, each mode has their own unique advantages and disadvantages. For example, there's a voice mode called SSB, and we'll be learning about that more later. But anyway, the SSB voice mode, it takes up a narrow bandwidth, which is good because it leaves more room for other signals on nearby frequencies. It has a small bandwidth, it doesn't take up a lot of space on the air. But the problem is the SSB voice mode doesn't quite sound so good. It's sort of not very good quality audio. And the FM voice mode, it sounds great. Its audio quality is awesome, but it takes up a lot of bandwidth. In fact, FM signals take up between 10 to 15 kilohertz of bandwidth, which is about 5 times as much bandwidth as an SSB signal will take up. So that's a problem because it means that nobody else can operate in those 10 to 15 kilohertz of frequencies because that one frequency is taking up all that space and no one else can use that space. So now on ham radio, there are times when we don't care about bandwidth and we want good sound quality, so we might choose FM. And there are other times that we care more about bandwidth and we don't care much about sound quality, and in that case we choose SSB. And that's why we have all these different voice modes. Having many different voice modes for transmitting audio is actually quite useful. Anyway, though, I'm getting a little carried away. If you're confused a little right now, don't worry about it too much. All you really need to know for the test is that FM takes up 10 to 15 kilohertz of bandwidth. FM uses 10 to 15 kilohertz of bandwidth. That will be tested. And another thing you should also know and write in your notebooks, you should also know that FM is commonly the mode that is chosen for use with repeaters and packet radio transmissions. Repeaters and packet radio transmissions. So don't worry about that too much, what repeaters and what packet radio transmissions are. We haven't gotten to those sections yet. Those are in later sections of the Gordon List manual. But for now, just write these down. Write this down in your notebook because you will be asked about that in the test. Okay, so even though this section actually in the Gordon West manual, even though it isn't that long, we're still going to split it up in half today, and I'm going to use 2 video lectures to cover it. Because the last few questions in this section actually require a lot of explanation, and it gets a little detailed. So in order to keep your brains from exploding or something, I've decided to stop here and we'll make another video lecture for the rest of the material. And that way, if you're tired so far just with what I've said and you're having trouble processing everything I said just now, you can stop for today and you can watch the second video lecture tomorrow if you want. Or if you're not tired and you're ready to move on, then you can go ahead and watch the next video lecture right now and continue on right now. It's your choice. But whatever you do, take a short break at least. You deserve it.